All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from. I'm Brian Sharp with SafetyChain Software, and want to welcome all of you to this month's edition of the Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. And as for those of you that have been following us since we started this series, gosh, about a year and a half ago now, we're seeing more and more requests and questions in the area of operations, and in particular, as we were joking about as we were writing some of the headlines for this webinar, is OEE is on the mind, right? So we're hearing more and more about OEE in the marketplace, and it's an instrumental part of what's making our customers successful. And what we wanted to do today was explore not just what it is and what it means to a food company, but what food manufacturers in particular really should be thinking about with OEE, because it's such a broad subject and it becomes very overwhelming very quickly. And so we are bringing in the best of the best, and I'll be introducing him in more detail, but a returning star to our show here, Daniel Campos, and he's going to be digging in a little bit to what they see out right in the trenches there. So we'll go ahead and get started here. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, first we just want to say thank you. We put these on for our community, for the benefit of our community, and you keep coming, we'll keep producing them. And the goal here is to provide true educational value, and that's why we bring in folks like London Consulting Group so that they can share their expertise. And among others, the thought leaders, experts, regulatory leaders, practitioners that are working with companies and literally doing the work. So the goal is to give you some really tangible, tactical ideas and strategies that you can take away, as we like to say, beyond just the compliance side. So thanks for being part of it. We hope you enjoy the content. If anyone charged you to get in, please go get your money back. We put these on for free. Again, it's something that we're really proud of, and we think it's really important to be able to give back to the food safety and quality community there. So you'll hear a lot through these webinars about strategy and tactics and different approaches, and they're all fantastic and amazing things. Where we can help is executing them on the technology side. So at SafetyChain, not just the proud sponsor of the series, but we are also a food quality management system, and we're really focused on helping companies improve productivity, profitability, and compliance on a single end-to-end platform. So anything that happens from the time you receive your goods to the time you ship them out, we're really helping streamline and make that more efficient, which is obviously on our minds today as we talk about OEE. So you can learn more about us over at our website at safetychain.com, and we certainly hope to be a resource and a partner for those of you that are looking for some technology. A few housekeeping things just to keep in mind here. So one is we try and make these as kind of informal or educational as possible, and part of that is making sure we're answering your questions. So we're going to field those questions during the course of the webinar, but we're going to save them for the end at a Q&A session. You'll notice that your questions are just coming to the panelists, so you don't have to worry about them being broadcast to everybody. If they get a little too specific, we might take those offline. But I've been assured by Daniel that he and his team will be happy to take anything we're unable to get to or that might require a little bit more detailed follow-up, which is a pretty cool thing for them to do. So keep in mind for that. The other thing, and I'll probably answer the most common question, is yes, we'll be recording this. And again, Daniel and the London Consulting Group team were kind enough to allow us to share this content. And I can say that last year, the content they shared became one of our more popular pieces that we were able to distribute. So stay tuned for that. But yes, we'll send in the coming days a link to the recording and to the deck itself. Last but not least, we're on a webinar system. Sometimes they get a little wonky, weather or bandwidth or otherwise. So if you have any audio issues, you can use the chat box. We have Ann Grace on our team who will be monitoring that and do our best to help you out. Sometimes the old go-to move is just to switch. You have the option to go phone audio or computer audio, and sometimes just swapping can help resolve that. But we'll do our best to help you behind the scenes. If you have questions for Daniel, then please put those into the questions box, and I'll monitor those as we get towards that time of the show. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and first make sure he's on the line. So Daniel, are you there? Can you hear me all right?
I am here. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon.
Awesome. So grateful to have you back. As I mentioned, I'm going to make him blush now, but super humble guy, but just brought such great content last year and was brought back by high demand. And so appreciate you making the time and digging into this, specific topic around OEE. You can see by his bio, and definitely encourage you to reach out to him on LinkedIn and stay connected, but has a ton of experience in this area, working with large and small companies alike throughout North America, but really has an expertise in food manufacturing, production, and obviously today you're going to hear about a deep expertise in OEE. So with that, Daniel, I'm going to get out of the way because they came to hear you, and just thank you again for being here. We're just really happy to have you.
Thank you, Brian. Happy to be here. And thank you, everyone, for making the time to talk about these topics today with me. I'll be happy to take you through a couple of material pieces here and to answer any questions you may have. I'll very quickly give you some background on our company, London Consulting Group. We've been in the business of shaping our clients' business for over 25 years. We do operate throughout the Americas, all the way down to Chile. And this year, we're starting operations in Canada and Spain. So very happy about having new customers out there. In the US, we have focused on food, and you may recognize a few of these companies. Not all of them are in food, but most of them are. And we serve those customers with projects throughout the operational cycle, from strategic planning, certainly, sales and marketing and the organizational side of it. Then there's supply chain and operations, and we'll talk a little bit about operations today with OEE, and we'll touch into IT as well, and some of the other aspects that have been relevant to this series, like certifications, GFSI, and FISMA support. But today we are focusing specifically on OEE, and I'll try to touch on these few topics. So we'll initially start with a very brief overview of what OEE is. Most folks are familiar with it, but we'll talk about specific cases that kind of require us to go back to basics. So I'll try to do that real fast. We'll also talk about Industry 4.0, which is a big topic here, very relevant for OEE measurements, especially if you want to do this en masse. And also, I'll talk about some of the solutions we're implementing for our customers that capitalize on the connectivity that is now pervasive. It's easier than ever. Hopefully, we'll have some Q&A around impacting the bottom line. I have a few ideas to share with you, and so also some pitfalls, but certainly this is where I hope we can make this worthwhile your time. Just send me your questions, and we'll have a good discussion here. As you know, the goals for today are talking about 7 ways to influence the key drivers of OEE. We'll talk about pre-op inspections in ways that are new if you're just focusing on regulatory pre-ops. And then somehow different ways that OEE can be applied to unusual manufacturing, along with technology uses, and OEE is a competitive advantage. But let's start by just saying, what is OEE? And no pun intended, but it is about time that we talk about this, and rate and yield. So OEE is the acronym for Overall Equipment Effectiveness. And so it's the measure of the achievement of the machinist standard. And this idea of standard it's pivotal here. It's one of the big pitfalls we see with our clients trying to measure OEE correctly. I'll touch about this, I'll talk about standard a couple of times here, but do realize that measuring standards is the topic of an entirely new series, altogether. It really is a big deal. Standard, anyways, when we talk about standard today, it's where I'm going to be referring to the best demonstrated performance, okay, or setting. And so when we talk about OEE using standard, then what we're trying to explain is the reasons why any equipment or line is underperforming and separate the reasoning behind it, any underperformance between stoppages, slow rates, or rejects, or quality in general, right? We do have this, OEE, the elements of OEE are availability, performance, and quality. Sometimes we call them time, velocity, and quality, whatever makes it easier for our customers to understand and for operators to understand. And so let me see if I can, here I go. And so today I'm going to start with this super simple example. Bear with me. We'll talk about this imaginary production line that works an 8-hour shift, no breaks or anything like that. Obviously that plays into this, but not for this example. And so just to illustrate how simple OEE can be, just imagine this line produces 50 units per hour at 8 hours. That's 400 expected units per shift. And it turns out that this machine actually ran for 7 hours because the setup took an hour. And not only that, instead of 50 units per hour, it produced 40 per hour, down to 280. However, warehouse reported only 250 pieces arrived. And so, it's pretty obvious that we're missing pieces. That this frowny face is a good description of how we would all feel in this scenario. But let's look at it differently. Now, OEE allows us to break it down into the 3 components. So availability, performance, and quality. And so if you look at this full potential here, I'm making a note here of the units or the unit of measure for each perspective, but they all play together, right? So initially we could work for 8 hours and produce 50 units per hour. And so kind of the cascade effect here, if we lose an hour, now the potential is only this gray zone here, so 7 hours at standard. If we then further works a bit more slowly, then that means that given this potential right here of 7 total hours, we then still missed our goal. And then because we only made 280 units, in fact, or the machine processed 280 units, we can no longer produce any more than that, and then we can still kind of cascade down to 250. The magic of TVC or time velocity quality, OEE, is that these percentages multiplied together will give you the 62.5% in this example. But a perhaps more natural way to see this is that we wanted to achieve 400 units and we only received 250, which is in fact 62.5. And so this is the very nature of OEE. We're then able to say where did we fail, and then we know that we missed some available time by breakdowns or changeovers in this case, 20% of our opportunity on speed, and about 10% of our opportunity in quality. That's exactly what you want to see on a well-implemented OEE system, the ability to separate the reasons behind any underperformance. Where a lot of folks stop short is applying OEE in the context of costs. And so if you are somebody involved in operations in your company, I encourage you to think about it this way. Most companies will share some sort of costing signaling in operations, or perhaps you have full visibility of P&L, and it really does matter, because if this imaginary line costs $1,000 a day to run per shift, then the unit costs $4 instead of the potential 285. So it's a big chunk of change that you are failing to distribute if this was fixed cost, and it's just because there's underperformance. Now clearly this is just an example, and and lines don't operate as simple as this. But this frame of reference allows us to take a step back and just think of your line in these three, from these three perspectives. Are you using your time available to the max? Are you compliant with, this is where the big word comes back in, with the standard compliance for performance for your line, so speed or the rate of production? And then are you wasting units? And this doesn't only refer to units sort of at the end of the line, but it also, when talk about this in some of these specific cases a bit more clearly, but we're also wasting units perhaps during setup. So all the different sources of waste, if you guys are into Six Sigma, you talk about this all the time. Anyways, OEE allows us to have these perspectives, and then because you can think about these discrete ways that you're losing performance, then you can focus on the controls that drive each one of these elements. In the use of available time, clearly there's breakdowns. That's the number one concern for most processors. But then there are changeovers, there are micro stoppages that are very difficult to measure unless you're automating this measurement. And then there's preventative maintenance that can go beyond the standard, right? So you're changing a motor, and instead of taking 30 minutes, it takes you 3 hours because you did not have it in stock. And there may be some feeding or interface between a hopper or a pump that feeds this machine, and that all allows for a poor availability. On the performance side, there's line balancing, which is difficult to assess if you have a complex facility. There's certainly certain types of waste that reduce speed. It doesn't mean that you're using units, but you're wasting time or motions. There are micro stoppages here that can also affect speed, especially if you have lines like, for example, bottling lines that feed labels and bottles and caps. And so the line slows down to allow for hoppers to fill back up. And that is also one of the reasons behind slow performance. And then just generally some of the more dynamic factors, and we'll talk a little bit more about these factors later on, but things like optimal running conditions. So for example, stable air pressure or temperature or moisture in the air. And then a bit more intangible factors like proper training. Perhaps you're familiar with differences between speed of production in different shifts, and it turns out to be just different crews, and that all comes down to training and experience. And then preventative speed adjustments. So there's a line of thought here that says that OEE is perhaps not the best tool for every condition, because when your waste is very expensive, think about, I don't know, perhaps medical devices that have very valuable components. If you mess one up, you're losing $10,000. So it's slower is faster, if you know what I mean. So there's that. And then finally, for quality, this is, I'm preaching to the choir here, so I'll just say SPC, failure mode analysis, and controls that are very familiar to this group that are, however, improvable, if that's a word, to account for some of the things we're going to include in this analysis today. So how do we bring it all together once we understand the basics? I'll start by saying that manufacturers that think about OEE only as a throughput metric kind of miss that opportunity. In our standard consulting practice, what we strive to do is transform the culture of our clients to use the foundation of OEE as part of the continuous improvement program, and then turn that into, like I mentioned, analysis of costing and perhaps even lost sales and some of the other factors that play into continuous improvement. And so this is, perhaps easy to say, comprehensive root cause analysis, but we also see that organizations fail to incorporate all of the voices that have something to say about OEE in a given line. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And so this is a simplified framework of the pieces of the puzzle that allow for OEE to be part of your organization. Now, you'll realize something real quick here, reading from the bottom to the top. There is a way to have OEE implemented at your organization and accurately measure, and you're still not done. So if you start with a good analysis of the OEE input parameters, and this is where standards come into play, having the right standard, one that's achievable, one that is challenging, one that gets you to the target costs and the other related goals, as well as thinking about the acceptable level of quality and downtime and all of that. That takes a big deal out of any project. Training operators into why we are implementing OEE, how OEE affects their day-to-day, that's a big deal. We are now entering a golden age of data collection. In different circles, it's called a little bit differently, but let's call it Industry 4. And so we'll talk about the yellow part of this in the last section of today's presentation, but I will just skim through it and I'll say Industry 4, single source of standard parameters, hopefully centralizing to the ERP that flows into the plant. And that's more or less what you need to have an OEE system in the plant. We'll talk about ways to take it further. And so once you do have this, it's time to revamp your culture to include OEE input-output into your daily routines. And so that's where pre-op inspections and supervisors' daily routines come into play. We'll talk about that in just a sec. And then augmenting your CI program with the means to get down to the root cause. And so having technology also allows you to do real-time OEE analytics. I'll give you an example of how this is done, what this looks like, so that you can imagine it at your facility. And certainly cost analysis supported by OEE, which is the ultimate goal. All right, so very quickly, this is how we're going to talk about these initiatives. So I've split the common issues that we've already seen by elements: availability, performance, and quality. And so this is what we already kind of talked about, but we'll go through a couple of these initiatives. So I'll tell you about them now, and then we'll go into the ones in bold letters in just a sec. So availability improvement circles. So these are sort of your Kaizen, generalized Kaizen style committee meetings. We'll talk about the redesigned pre-op inspections, because what we want to do is bring those optimal conditions and start of day inspections together with your regulatory pre-op inspections. And we'll talk about that. Preventative maintenance. This is a very broad subject. Put a CMS in place. If you don't have one, it's much harder to be in compliance, regulatory compliance. But then on top of that, if you don't have one, you'll have a lot of breakdowns. So invest in one. We can point you in the right direction if you want to. Training and daily routines and real-time visibility are all aspects of how you run your facility. So we'll talk about that, but it essentially involves your operators, your leaders, and your supervisors, and all the way up to top management. And we'll talk about special cases where OEE outright is not as easy to implement. So hopefully we can share a couple of ideas of industries that are difficult to implement, like dairy or liquid processing, where OEE kind of takes a different shape. Right, so I'll talk about these few items, starting with availability. So Availability Improvement Committee is, broadly speaking, a group of individuals that continuously analyze OEE downtime data. Sometimes there's an element of performance as well on the way the line is configured and who's operating which machines and whatnot. And the idea is that this committee implements quick hits to target downtime and added cost. So what this looks like in projects where this works very well is the opinion leader for the line or the manufacturing facility plant that brings people from production maintenance, scheduling, and then leads and operators, and they will work top down on focusing on root cause analysis. So here is where OEE starts to take on a more relevant nature, because what you want to do in these committees, what I want to encourage you to do very strongly, is to involve folks from other departments that can explore dynamic factors. And I have a very short list here of ideas that are oftentimes overlooked. So material availability is one of the silliest ways you can waste time and have poor performance. And this is essentially not double checking that you're starting a run that you can finish, either because the materials are unavailable, or they're expired, or they have not been released by quality, or some of the other factors that you all know and love. Very easy to fix, very hard to diagnose, because you're clearly going into procurement and perhaps supplier management and some of the other good stuff aspects that have a say in this. One of the other complicated factors here that I encourage you to look into is scheduling. So a lot of the unmeasured downtime relates to changeovers, or the speed of changeover between products that are incompatible, so to speak. So run length and changeover schedule are difficult to understand on their own. Bring it to a committee, will oftentimes produce solutions that very quickly have an impact on your performance. And then other aspects like order processing. Oh, the customer called, we need to quickly change the production plan to be able to serve this customer, priority number one. And other processes of quality inspections and holds are all dynamic factors that have little to do with the way the line is set up, how many people, how well they're trained, et cetera, et cetera. They're often overlooked while we look at why the machine breaks down, or the motors, and all the other usual factors that have something to do with OEE, and they, in our experience, have a big share of the potential benefits to improve your OEE. On a second topic, I'll talk about pre-op inspections, and I'll go real quick here just by saying that what you want to do is include productivity drivers. So change your pre-op inspections to think outside the box and cover those dynamic factors. So for example, material availability, the speed settings, quality control, and something that we've done very successfully for a number of customers is we just go beyond sheet of paper, and even go beyond the concept of a checklist itself, which is sort of the next step that you can do with software like SafetyChain. Try to build interlocks into machines that guarantee that the machine is not going to start unless the pre-op inspections, which include these dynamic factors, are met. So imagine this interaction between the ERP and the machine that automatically double checks that materials are available in the warehouse and are released in the quantities required for the recipe that's going to start. Or downloading speed, settings from the recipe or from the specification in the ERP into the PLC so that operators cannot change them, so that your speed settings will be always respected according to your cost goals, performance cost goals. There are just a couple of ways that you can think beyond pre-ops and be a bit more effective with this. One other big deal about OEE and ways to improve is to structure a day so that leads and supervisors have line productivity as part of their checklist. And so this is sort of a pre-op or a not necessarily but a checklist that a supervisor or a lead continuously uses throughout the shift to ensure productivity. And so this, hand in hand with the next step, which is real-time visibility, has a huge impact on lines that just transform themselves because we're looking. So this is a daily routine that steps away from some operators have this, some manufacturers just have very experienced supervisors that perhaps come from the line, from being very good operators, but have never been taught how to be a good supervisor. So build a daily routine that's based on training, on focusing on productivity, on being a leader for the area, and then pair it up with this real-time visibility. We routinely improve productivity by 10, 15 points just because we're measuring. So I hope this concept is clear, but just instead of letting supervisors go around the plant, quote unquote, and making things happen, help them with a guide that says, when you do go around the plant, focus on these 15 or 20 points. And that alone has an effect. But when you pair it up with something like this, real-time visibility of productivity, this makes a huge difference. So this is where technology comes in. And so what you want to do is identify the top factors that operators can control. And so perhaps it's speed settings, but it could also be the feeding of material. And so build those together into a report that operators can see at all times. So perhaps you have a screen next to the machine, or if it's a larger place, you've got a TV stuck on the wall showing something like this. And so this is actually a report that we produce for a bottling line. And you'll see that we have a wide range of information pieces here. But what I want you to focus on are 2 or 3 things. Number one, short time visibility of performance. So what we want to show here, and every one of these blocks is a 15-minute period. You'll see that we have 4 hours in this display. And so this run is supposed to go all the way to here. And you'll see that in this first hour, operators did not meet the quota 3 out of 4 times in 15-minute periods. Second hour, they achieved the goal. And so this variance here is going to affect the time that this plant runs, how long this line runs to complete production, right? So you've got an expected run length and an actual run length and the amount of delay and total downtime. And here, very quickly, you can see how the line is doing an uptime and in compliance to standard rate. And here you'll see that we have no mention of OEE per se. And what we want is for operators to see a display that speaks their language and the common terms used for that plant, for that machine specifically. And so we've got, standard rate perfect, steady, slow, problematic, or right perfect, and a bit of a larger gap here, and then stop and go, mostly down and broken. So this is what we mean by bringing some of the data points that are the ones that are relevant for operators, that speak to them in terms of things they can control, and make sure that they can see them very short periods of time, not at the end of the run, not at the end of the hour, real time, because this one does have a real time right here, right? And certainly, for the very short period of time preceding this moment, how am I doing? How can I compete against myself? This is a big deal, and there are more tools than ever now that allow you to do this. And so sometimes you have to think out of the box to be able to implement these principles and to calculate OEE accurately, or in ways that will help you. I'll say that, because some of these have to be a bit creative. So different product categories like cheese or mixed batches or continuous flow don't lend themselves to the piece-by-piece analysis of OEE like the example before. Right? So this is the example that we saw initially, where you have units and then units turned into, from time at standard turned into units and very easily flow into a calculation of quality. Unfortunately, when you have things like this, where you have cheese in vats, this I'm sure at least some of you are in this industry. You've got gallons of milk and cream that turn into pounds of curds and gallons of whey, and then are packaged into blocks of cheese, perhaps of a certain weight, standard weight. And it's difficult to do because you don't have let me step back here for just a sec. You don't have the standard units that flow throughout. What you do have are pipes and vats and then bags, right, or boxes. And then in addition, for this industry, you do have the components of milk, fat, solids, non-fat, and protein that matter because they're part of the specification, but also matter because that's what cheese makers pay. They'll pay for the components, not the milk itself. So it's different industry, and it has to do, there's a lot of chemistry here involved. There's density, there's weight and composition, et cetera, et cetera. So what we do is we turn OEE into a mass balance calculation. And hopefully this, although it's very niche, it may help some of you that are not in cheese but have processes that are similar to this. So because cycle times are longer, instead of filling a can or 150 cans per minute or something that's very fast, what you're doing here is you're cycling through a vat during hours and then perhaps packaging over the course of 6 or 7 hours after the product is done, after it's cured and whatnot. So what we do is instead of measuring downtime, we measure deviation to standard when we look at availability. So that means that instead of having the total full potential, we have the full potential plus any extras. And that is your actual availability, because you're wasting time beyond your plan. And then what that does is it still gives you a standard performance of pounds that would come out of this vat that took however many hours to bake or to make. And so what we want to see is variance to formula in the performance, because you're making pounds that are in compliance. And then finally, you've got a measurement of mass balance. So let me go back here real quick. So perhaps here you've got, let's call it 100 pounds of fat that goes into this vat, and you would ideally want to see the equivalent of 100 pounds of butter fat in the number of blocks here. It doesn't always happen like that, and so you could have a combined, a separate OEE for each component, or you can have just total pounds of balance that have to do with yield. So if you have a good standard set up for this, then your OEE will not be 100%, but it'll be a number you can target. Cheese makers, but also I'm going to say processors of things like kombucha that have a fermentation process and somehow have difficulty with very long batching, can benefit from an approach like this. I want to talk about a different case, one that involves technology, and then I'll very quickly jump into sort of that technology piece overall. And so this is, for example, a brewer or soda bottler for which the properties of the batch are well known. What you're actually doing is just filling to a level. And so you've got beer gallons with a known density or potency, and you've got bottles that come out of the right. So you can do an OEE of just the filling station, and that's very similar to example number one, where you have bottles per minute and then an output bottles per minute, and that's easy to do. If you want to go the extra mile and include the other elements of the line to do costing on it, then you probably need a flow meter. And so how we resolve this is that we derive, we do a bit of a mixed calculation here to consider fill rate. So this is how it works. You've got let's say an 8-hour line that produces so many fill cycles or bottles per minute or per hour. You've got your actual downtime for the filling line. And then what you want to see is a number of fill cycles. So this is bottles going into the filler and actually getting product. And then compare that to the fill variance in gallons of actual produced bottles or used material. So this is sort of a mass balance, but what you're trying to get to here is measure the fill factor. So we look at gallons and then at standard bottles fill size, and that way we can find out how much of the liquid that you started with in the batch, let's say beer, was sadly wasted or did not reach a bottle that can be served. This is also a way to measure overfill or underfill. Mostly it's overfill, and that's how you get closer to cost. So some of these special cases require modern technology. We've been doing OEE projects for 20 years plus, and most of the times during those 20 years, technology has not been as available as it is today, and you can certainly measure OEE on paper even. The principles are the same. What you want to do is make sure that there is short-term visibility for operators every hour, let's say, and that operators and supervisors get together and have committees to discuss ways to improve. But now we can use Industry 4 with its key principles to improve on our efforts. So if you have not heard about this Industry 4, comes out of Germany, and it basically specifies a framework for devices in industry going forward. So number one, they need to be interconnected. So think of your current sensors that perhaps drive data into PLCs. Well, let's make sure that they are all part of a larger network that goes into a database. Second principle is access to information. So that database needs to be accessible, openly accessible, so you can query it and drive analytics, so that number three, operators may have real-time analytics available so that they can draw insights that are pushed into their HMI and they can make decisions. And just in case, number four, systems should be able to make decisions autonomously, so that based on certain programming, there can be conclusions that drive then PLCs back into the way machines are running. And so this ability to do Industry 4 in the enterprise allows you to still drive the three basic elements of OEE and facilitate some of the very difficult tasks in fine-tuning OEE performance. So for example, on the use of available time, and we've already spoken about these elements in the bottom, right? Tracking downtime and downtime reasons accurately is a big issue, especially when we get to micro stoppages. that just essentially slow down or perhaps provide, in some instances, very fast machines that have hundreds of bottles come through every minute. You can measure the distance between bottles and fine-tune the vat as a way to squeeze the last 3 to 5% out of the machine. And that's impossible to do, obviously, with an eye, or even at, using statistics. It's difficult to derive the variances. So tracking downtime that way is certainly a possibility, and one that, if you're not doing it, perhaps you should consider doing it. And something that we also encourage processors to look for is a rich timetable of the process. That is, out of the 8 hours, specific minutes or sectors or areas during the day where the machine slowed down or actually was down. Some of the other elements we've already talked about, but having real-time data driven from the sensors and accumulated into the database makes things really easy. So real-time OEE feedback, the panel that I shared with you a couple of slides ago that operators can look at, that's a big deal, and it is enabled by this technology. Condition checks, vibration, temperature that are correlated with slower performance, the speed settings driven by ERP, we talked about that. And then on this side, the connectivity to, for instance, SPC or food safety controls that are sort of real time. Think about inline bricks or pH measurements that can greatly reduce the incidence of failure or quality losses. For instance, think about a specific torque check that's real time or 100% testing, and then down to lab machine conditions. So we have projects today that bring data together from lab, it's like a Milko scan or something like that. And that really makes a difference in measuring OEE with greater accuracy. And so we go back to this, right? So I4 supported data together with a single source of standard parameters certainly allows you to do OEE accurately. And so what you want to do is support real-time OEE analytics, and most importantly, do cost analysis. Don't do OEE just to improve machine performance. You have to bring costing into it. Remember the example of the medical device. You don't want to go faster if that leads to bigger costs. So bring cost into it, and this is essentially what this looks like. To kind of summarize, whatever your current state is, define OEE goals. Identifies the source of data. This is on the I4 Industry 4 path. Thoroughly research best demonstrated standards. I can't stress this enough. Again, this is the topic of a completely different series. Having the right standards that are fair to everyone, if you will, and that match the organization's goal. Do a slow rollout of OEE line by line. You can do OEE all day long, easy, but to do it this way, do a slow rollout and pair it up with the rollout of a continuous improvement program with this change management and some of the other disciplines that I mentioned, like procurement, like scheduling, that have a huge impact on OEE and are often overlooked. And then certainly look to cost analysis and target savings. Be strict on recipes and standard batches and variants, et cetera, et cetera. It'll make a big difference in the way you're looking at OEE. We've seen a ton of projects where companies say they are measuring OEE. They say that they think that they're having a good performance or have seen some improvements. Certainly that happens. But when you come in and you figure out that it's still so focused on the machines that it doesn't consider all the factors, that's where the big potential for improvement comes from. And I hope that you're inspired by these very high-level ideas to improve on the OEE efforts in your organization. And with that, Brian, I'll give it back to you. Perhaps there are questions.
Yeah, well, absolutely. First, just a big thank you. I think one thing that we always appreciate, not just how you do it on the webinars, but how you help our customers as a great partner. Just your ability to simplify the complex and stay focused on the big stuff. That this, I like the note on that last slide there. It really is a competitive advantage. We don't always talk about it that way, or as much as we should that way. So really appreciate you pulling all this together and putting so much into a short time. Do have some questions, so I'll kind of do a little bit of a rapid fire, and then as I mentioned, Daniel was kind enough to offer to take anything we don't get to offline, or if you have something specific, we'll share his contact info in the follow-up with the link, and definitely encourage you to reach out to his team. They're just a tremendous asset for us. So I got one that's tactical, and then one actually that I had was around committees. But I'm going to start with the tactical one, which is just around what's your recommendation on classifying downtime?
Yeah, a great question. So what you want to do is drive the classification of downtime to the root cause. We often see downtime classified very broadly. For example, mechanical or supplies, or just overall breakdown, and that doesn't really help. It doesn't happen that often, but typically what we do see is very specific machines that are part of the breakdown. So the packager or the labeler or the date coder or whatever it is as the reasons for downtime. And that also, although it's certainly an improvement, it doesn't help a lot. Perhaps it's part of the data gathering process, but what you'll see once you jump into those committees is operators and supervisors. If you encourage them, they'll come up with better reasons. So they'll say, yeah, the motor broke because electricity, or because the airline, or the labeler is not working because the stock is different, or kind of like that.
Right.
You want to encourage folks to give you the specific reason behind the downtime code. One of the challenges we do have is the data collection. And so if you happen to have an automated data collection, and perhaps you noticed on the screen that I shared, there are buttons on the bottom to specify the reasons for downtime.
Right.
If you can customize those to the specifics of the line as you make progress with the root cause analysis, over time you'll have very specific downtime codes that will be much more relevant. But do try to find those.
That's great, and we hear that from our customers, that information that was maybe previously just a gut feel, or maybe what one shift says versus another, it really eliminates all of that, and they can much more quickly and accurately get to obviously the root cause, but make the improvements. So it's cool to see that. What's one of the most rewarding things is to see customers see that information for the first time. It's a really powerful thing. You mentioned committees, which ties into kind of next question. Great. So and I might have a part two of this one, but question is around the improvement committees. Are those different than our Kaizen groups? Do you have any thoughts on how to form those?
Yeah, well, I think they can be. The principle is perhaps the same. You want to look at events specifically, but at a higher level, committees do need to look at the broader, bigger picture. And that's why I've mentioned this today, and we encourage customers to do this in projects. You can't just think about the line, which a Kaizen event often does, right? You have to think about the larger picture. Sometimes we go as far as doing value process mapping first on the way data and materials flow into the line once you do start it. So see how all of the previous steps have an impact on productivity. And that tends to be eye-opening. They tend to be eye-opening events. So they are slightly different from Kaizen events. Some of the basis of those of the team building for a Kaizen event apply. So you're not starting from scratch, but if you're being very specific, which you often are with Kaizen events, this you have to think broader. Certainly.
That makes sense. Good. So you can kind of leverage some of the work you're doing there. And if you have any other questions for anybody, please feel free to fire those in as we wrap up here next couple minutes. I wanted to make a point, and then it kind of leads to a question we have here. One just about the importance of culture. You talked about in the beginning how critical that is for you and your teams when you go in there and transforming that culture. And I think one of the things that we see really successful companies in this area is not just their food safety culture and this culture around operations, but it's really around the culture and how they think about the operators on the floor more than just capturing data and really empowering them. And so I thought you provided some really important insight about how critical they are and how they can be part of this. Do you have any other examples? So the question here is more about, do you have other examples of ways to provide productivity visibility for the operators? So in other words, what are ways we can make it easier and better for them to have that data right in their hands on the floor? Do you have anything like that that would be helpful?
Oh, certainly. I mentioned how historically when automation was not as pervasive as it is today, or as easy to achieve as it is today, we have been creative in providing data that perhaps the supervisor calculates. And I'll give you an example, something that we did perhaps 15 years ago or so at this facility that had a very high-speed machine and that had issues with performance. But calculating expected results was kind of difficult. So if you're old school, kind of like me, perhaps you've seen maps where you can calculate distances between cities in this sort of triangular matrix, from city to city, and then the intersection of that matrix is the distance, right? So even building tools like that to facilitate operators to calculate the expected run rate makes a difference in facilitating them looking at OEE on an hourly basis, because they have to calculate it themselves.
Right.
And it doesn't matter, right? That's perfectly fine. You should not wait until there's automation into your facility to start something like this, because the moment you put an eye to OEE in any process, you will improve it just by looking at it. This is where your reference to culture comes into play. Most folks want to do better. They want to have an easier day at work. Nobody likes to struggle with a machine that fails constantly, or they don't want to be, missing baseball games with their kids because the run is long and slow, right? So there is something to say about sharing these ideas with operators. And I'll say this, about 50% of the time we invest in customers with their employees is around change management, about culture building, about looking at the machine and making it your own. This is your shift. This is your team. This is your product and customer. Love it. Let's improve on it, et cetera, et cetera. That goes a long way to facilitating OEE and some of these other improvement principles in the enterprise.
I love that, and I think we talked about a few different areas. I think I wrote down OEE standard. We're going to have to maybe find a time for that next series, but it also ties nicely into another really big challenge I'm sure many of you on here are facing is with the workforce, right? And when we can empower them and make their job easier and get them home for that baseball game, those all go a long way to retention. And so I think that can help in a lot of areas. So Daniel, thank you again. This was fantastic. As I mentioned at the top, we will send out a link with access to the recording, to the deck, and highly recommend that you connect with Daniel and his team, London Consulting Group, on LinkedIn, and we'll give you some direct contact information there as well. This is obviously something they do quite well and quite often, and have been just a tremendous partner for us here at SafetyChain. We also have other downloads and recorded webinars, including Daniel's last year, and so I encourage you to check out some of the other resources we have. And if there's some help we can provide on the technology side, we certainly would love to talk with you about what we're doing, not just in the area of compliance, food safety and quality, but certainly in the OEE and production areas. So we've got a lot of really exciting things we'd love to share. So thank you again, Daniel. Really great having you back, and look forward to doing it again.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. Thanks everybody for your time. Have a great day.